Well, I think we might as well begin. We've got a lively panel today and looking forward to it. So I'd like to welcome you to today's event hosted by the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. Today we're having a panel discussion on a book by Antony Lerman, Whatever Happened to Antisemitism, Redefinition and the Myth of the Collective Jew. My name's Stephen Clingman. I'm a professor in the English department at UMass. I've stepped into Alon Confino's role today, who normally hosts these events. Alon cannot be here for medical reasons, and so has asked me to step in. I'd like to offer my special thanks to our speakers today for participating, and also my personal thanks to Paz Goldstein, who does so much behind the scenes at these events and makes sure that everything runs properly. Thank you, Paz. Just some notes for the audience that you can visit the IHGMS website for more information about the spring program and to learn about past events. This and all IHGMS events are recorded and uploaded to the IHGMS YouTube channel and its website. Links to these will be sent out by Paz in the chat, so please look out for those. So this is a most intriguing and thought-provoking book. Anti-Semitism is one of the most controversial topics of our time. We talk a huge amount about anti-Semitism, but are not always sure what it is. And in fact, there are deep disagreements on how to define it. In Antony Lerman's book, Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism, Redefinition and the Myth of the Collective Jew, he argues that this confusion is the result of a 30-year process of redefinition of the phenomenon, casting Israel as the persecuted, quote, collective Jew and the main victim of anti-Semitism. The consequences of this redefinition, Lerman argues, are alarming, suppressing free speech on Palestine and Israel, legitimizing Islamophobic forces, and making Jews more, not less, vulnerable. Discussing the book today, we have a wonderful panel, including Zvi Ben-Dor Benite, Lila Corwin Berman, Noura Erakat, and Sherene Seikaly. They will speak first in order, and Antony Lerman will respond. Just a further quasi-medical note that Noura has not been well and isn't able to present her notes herself, so Shireen Seikaly will read Nura Erakat's notes. So the order we will go in is we'll first have Lila Corwin Berman, then Noura's notes, and then Zvi Benite, and then Shireen. A few words of introduction on each of them. Antony Lerman is a senior fellow at the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue in Vienna, as well as being an honorary fellow at the Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish and Non-Jewish Relations at the University of Southampton. He's also an associate editor of Patterns of Prejudice. He was the founding director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London and founding director of the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, a grant-making organization. In addition to his current book, he's also the author of The Making and Unmaking of a Zionist, A Personal and Political Journey, published in 2012, and co-author of Bad News for Labor, Anti-Semitism, the Party and Public Belief, and he's also the editor of Do I Belong? Reflections from Europe. Going in alphabetical order, Zvi Ben-Dor Benite is Professor of History and Middle Eastern Studies at NYU. He's the author of The Tao of Muhammad, A Cultural History of Muslims in Late Imperial China, published in 2005. Also of The 10 Lost Tribes, A World History, 2009. Most recently, an edited volume on Middle Eastern Jewish thought. And he has other books forthcoming, one on sovereignty and the other on Crescent China, Islam and Nation After Empire. Lila Corwin Berman holds the Murray Friedman Chair of American Jewish History at Temple University, where she directs the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History. Her most recent book, The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution, has been awarded prizes from the Organization of American Historians and the American Jewish Historical Society. She's also published widely in venues ranging from the American Historical Review to the Washington Post, the Forward, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Noura Erakat is a human rights attorney, associate professor of Africana Studies, and the program of criminal justice at Rutgers University. She's the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, published in 2019, which received the Palestine Book Award and the Bronze Medal for the Independent Publishers Book Award in Current Events and Foreign Affairs. And Sherene Seikaly is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her book, Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy and Mandate Palestine, published in 2016, explores economy, territory, the home, and the body. She has a forthcoming book, From Baltimore to Beirut, on the question of Palestine, which tells a global history of capital, slavery, and dispossession. She is the co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and Jadaliyya also. So much for the introductions. And as I mentioned, the order of speakers will be Lila Corwin Berman first, then Noura's notes read by Shireen, then Zvi, and then Shireen herself, and then Antony will respond. So I will turn it over to you, Lila.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I know alone couldn't preside over this program, but I certainly feel his presence and feel really so grateful to Alon for bringing together this group of people to talk about this really extraordinary book. And I think the book is extraordinary for so many reasons, but it is also such a necessary kind of programmatic way of understanding where we are. So I feel just a great deal of gratitude for it. And I want to start by praising the title. Titles can be hard to think of. And I really appreciate the title because I think it's a real question. Sometimes we ask questions not to ask a real question, but to make a point. But I think the question of whatever happened to anti-Semitism is in fact anchored in a real curiosity. And throughout the book, Tony's curiosity, really drives such a deep kind of desire to actually understand that question. And it is historically minded. And it brought to mind, the way that so many of our kind of foundational texts to understand anti-Semitism are studying the pre-1933 formation of anti-Semitism. And that what Tony really shows is that if we're going to answer the question, whatever happened to anti-Semitism, we need to think about what happened in a post-Holocaust, post-48 kind of landscape. And using Jonathan Judakin as a real kind of central scholar in the introduction, Tony tells us we need to think about an entangled history of anti-Semitism. And I think just as much as that, what comes through in this book is how important a discursive history is as well. That is, the way we talk about anti-Semitism is central to what happened to it. So as Stephen said, the core answer that's offered in this book is that what happened to anti-Semitism is the new anti-Semitism. And really, this book, unlike a whole crop of other books that have been, kind of advocating an approach of the new anti-Semitism, this book is a kind of historical genealogy of what the new anti-Semitism has done to anti-Semitism, right? And concludes that the new anti-Semitism shifted anti-Semitism from a force that acted upon Jews wherever they were and however they were constituted into a force that acted upon a self-proclaimed collective Jew, which is actually a nation state, that of Israel. So in the time I have, beyond praising the question, I want to raise really three of my own questions. And this is in the same spirit that I understand Tony's title as really being about curiosity. So I want to start by talking about quantification. Core to Tony's argument is that one of the things that happened to anti-Semitism is that people started to understand it differently. And this was partially because of geopolitical changes, but it also had to do with institutional changes and governmental changes, especially in the state of Israel. And apace those different changes were new tools of definition. And anybody who's been in this game for like half a second knows that we spend a great deal of time fighting over those definitions of anti-Semitism. In fact, it's a proxy for something, right, for lots of things. And much of what Tony's book shows is the way that that acts as a proxy. But he also does draw attention to quantification. So we have definition and sort of discourse, and then we have this kind of desire that seems to kind of grow in lockstep with the discourse of new anti-Semitism, this desire to quantify it. And I was thinking about the work of an ethnographer named Michal Kraveltovi, who talks about cultures of enumeration, and that the process of enumeration is linked to emotion, and that quantification is able to sort of produce and reproduce knowledge and norms, and it can serve as a kind of source of biopolitical and discursive discipline. And in all of these ways, I think this kind of culture of enumeration is really core to something that's going on with the new anti-Semitism, but I just want to dig into it a little more. So insofar as I understand the kind of culture of enumeration in the long span of Jewish history, whether you start with the Book of Numbers, or other kind of moments of census taking, I think it's served a particular role in the kind of Enlightenment era debates about the Jewish question. And this is when you see a real uptick in forms of quantification, especially having to do with the statistical sciences, asking, do Jews fit? Do they not fit? How can we prove that they do or they don't? And that quantification became a kind of barometer of the modern project. And so it's not surprising that enumeration and quantification is critical to discussions of anti-Semitism. But I want to kind of posit a theory about how it works and what might change with the new anti-Semitism and this quantification, which is, I think that, if I were to theorize, right, that the will to count anti-Semitism only arises when Jewish social thinkers and leaders develop the consciousness to think about anti-Semitism as a discrete and countable phenomenon, and one, therefore, that could be met with a kind of bureaucratized and institutionalized set of reforms and responses. And if this is the case, the question I have is, why are actors today so intent on quantifying anti-Semitism if more and more, as Tony tells us, their theory of the case is that anti-Semitism is ineradicable and is only answerable by the kind of collective national project of the Jewish people? Right. So in other words, part of my curiosity is if, Tony, you would actually expect to see a diminishing of these quantification efforts, especially if, as you show, the instances to be quantified are boundless, are infinite. If one counts every tweet, every retweet, the algorithmic world we live in means that quantification project could just spiral absolutely out of control, losing that sense of sort of discrete countability. Or is the quantification of the new anti-Semitism serving a different purpose, right? Less as an agent of reform, less as about kind of marking things as discrete, and more as a kind of financialized form of capital, which gets me into my second point. And then I have just one more short one. So another thing that's noted in this book that's so important is the really kind of incredible fractal-like proliferation of new anti-Semitism institutions. And I started to keep a list a couple of years ago, maybe since around 2015, of all the new organizations. And, there's like 15 to 20 new ones that have been established. And if you add in a few from before 2015, you get a list of 20 to 25. Hashtag End Jew Hatred, Alums for Campus Fairness, Anti-Semitism Accountability Project with the acronym ASAP, and so on. And what Tony did a really good job explaining is that no matter how kind of grassroots these organizations may look, right? So it can look like, all these different flowers blooming in all these different places, that they are really elite institutions. And their goal is not to mobilize grassroots action, but to calcify a set of ideas and discourses. And I think that's quite right. Two notable things I have noticed about these organizations that I think help kind of us understand this piece of the puzzle is, first of all, that with very few exceptions, they all have pro-Israelism as core to their mission, right? Inseparable from the act of quote unquote fighting or combating anti-Semitism. But the second thing is that their funding sources tend either to be one mega donor, so someone like Robert Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, or Ron Lauder from Estee Lauder. So maybe there's one mega donor, or the funding is really, really difficult. And I've spent a lot of time learning how to do this, really difficult to discern. A tangle of private foundations, lots of nested financial structures. So one group doing business as another, sort of hosting another. So if we think about the kind of quantification of anti-Semitism, and then this piece of the institutionalization, it starts to feel as if, much like capitalism, the project of new anti-Semitism has to be understood as seeking to grow profit. And so while the quantification of anti-Semitism might make little ideological sense, given how it's been framed anew, it sort of makes financial sense, right? And this could be a partial answer to the question I posed. But then there is another question, which is, how long does this capital project continue to spin out? So if the kind of premise of it is that this is always a losing battle, right? And that seems to be kind of what is at the foundation of this. How long do donors give to a losing battle? And if the numbers keep on rising, will there be a tipping point or some moment at which givers stop believing in the return on their investment? So my final point then brings us to the two different equations, or sort of an analogical thinking that exists in this book. One is the question of the relationship of anti-Zionism to the new anti-Semitism, and the other is the relationship of Zionism to anti-Semitism. So just as we should ask, and Tony asked, what is the outcome of equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, which is a hallmark of the new anti-Semitism? I want to push us also to think about the outcome of equating Zionism with anti-Semitism, which is suggested, at least by Tony at the end of the book. So I think I know that the outcome of conflating the new anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism is that if we were then to look for a metric to end anti-Semitism, it would have to be something along the lines of more people embracing Zionism or loving Israel, right? Like when you think about that equation, anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism and so forth, like what solves that? More people, I guess, really embracing Zionism, or more people disavowing anti-Zionism. So what's the outcome then of conflating anti-Semitism and Zionism? And that's a question that, as the book is sort of wrapping up and Tony makes a certain suggestion that part of what Zionism itself does is it actualizes certain kind of foundational notions of anti-Semitism. I do want to understand more of whether that project, which sounds like it could kind of end up down the same conflationist road as the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, does that have a different or better outcome? And what is that? Or should we find ways to kind of move away from these reductive framings? So I have so many more thoughts and questions, but I'm going to leave it at that. And I'm excited to hear other people's thoughts and discuss.
Thank you very much, Lila. That was great. And before Shireen reads Noura's notes, I just want to remind everybody in the audience that you can already, if you like, begin to post questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those afterwards. So Shireen has kindly offered to read for Noura. So Shireen, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm reading now from Noura Erakat's comments. She says, congratulations, Tony, which is he's asked us to refer to him by his first name, on accomplishing such an ambitious feat of tracing what anti-Semitism is and is not, historically and in the present, within Jewish political and intellectual thought. As a reader, you provided us a front row seat to the most detailed exchanges in letters, speeches, statements, and debates, which perhaps only you could have offered from your vantage point of participant observer. The result is this tremendous offering to the historical record, which continues to play out and is of the most significant consequence as recent events in Palestine attest. I will begin and end my remarks in Palestine as the greatest stakeholders in how we resolve the question on whatever happened to anti-Semitism. According to racial and colonial logics, Palestinians are occluded from the conversation, and their very occlusion establishes the current terms of the debate. Just a few days ago, Israeli settlers, with the backing of the state's armed forces, rampaged Hawara, Burin, and Zatara, burned down homes, killed one man in a year that has already featured 2 massacres and a total of 60 Palestinians killed. Minister Smotrich, now responsible for affairs in the West Bank, has urged that the whole city, quote unquote, be wiped out. Such events are, in fact, the greatest threats of racism, the reason we combat racism, precisely because it kills. Yet the conversations on new anti-Semitism obscure this altogether and have us equating all forms of harm. Yet in the international human rights order, there is a hierarchy of priorities that begins with the protection of bodily integrity and ends with the protection of dignity. How has this most obvious principle been lost here? And how can centering it help us better navigate a debate on what anti-Semitism is or is not? In the very first chapter, Varieties of Confusion of Understanding Anti-Semitism, Tony shows with excruciating and meticulous detail the lack of consensus on the meaning of anti-Semitism, even among notable bedfellows. Aside from its tremendous labor, the chapter is powerful in light of a heightened sense that anti-Semitism is on the rise, as suggested by under-scrutinized data. The juxtaposition provides reason for a measured pause. The chapter's findings are also striking in light of the steady march to adopt the IHRA definition, the IHRA definition, among unions, associations, universities, student governments, and city councils, as if it was a settled issue. More, the most potent response to the IHRA definition to date is another definition offered by the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. Yet definitions, even if they are available, are inadequate. Firstly, consider the work of critical theorist Shireen Al-Adeimi, who has urged us to find sufficient value in explanations as illustrative and instructive offerings, as opposed to a definition which is quasi-legal in its ability to regulate and punish. Such quasi-law is problematic for being both too expansive as well as too narrow in protecting against harm. Secondly, the larger question seems to be not what is anti-Semitism, but how is it a form of racism? What Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes as a political economy that relegates an inferior class to premature death. Is racism not the essence of the risk to Jewish life and others subject to racial regimes? Is it not the logic that justifies the deprivation of wealth, success, opportunity, education, family, dignity, the very possibility of life, as somehow being a natural phenomenon, and worse, the fault of the targeted communities themselves? And still, the question of racism is glossed over altogether in the contemporary discussion of the new anti-Semitism. And instead, what is scrutinized are acceptable forms of speech. What is acceptable to say about Jewish people? When is it acceptable to say it, and by whom? In 1967, literary activist James Baldwin illuminated this predicament when he wrote that Blacks are, quote, anti-Semitic because they're anti-white. End of quote, in reference to a Jewish acceptance of whiteness following the Second World War, conditioned on a distant from and negation of Blackness. In 2022, TV host and actress Whoopi Goldberg came under rightful scrutiny for insisting that the Holocaust was not about race. When a reporter pushed back and said, quote, Nazis saw Jews as a race, end of quote, the Nazis measured the heads and noses of Jewish people to, quote unquote, prove that they were a distinct race. Goldberg seemingly doubled down on a colorist framework that equated race to Blackness and replied, quote, they did that to Black people too, but it doesn't change the fact that you could tell a Jew on a street, you could find me, you couldn't find them, end of quote. Goldberg's comments, insensitive as myopic as they are, reflect an anemic understanding of racism, particularly in the United States. Sorry, since 1977, when the Supreme Court, Bakke, I think, versus UC Davis, established that white people are a protected class under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, anti-racism has been equated to colorblindness, and racism is the recognition of difference. Hence today, affirmative action, a core remedial element of racism in international law, is considered reverse racism in the United States. This depoliticizing pivot deliberately assumed the moral high ground as it preserved all forms of inequality and stratification. Thus, constituent elements of racial regimes have fallen out of the bottom of our discussion on racism, most significantly the element of power, and we are left in a whirlwind of subjectivity, attitudes, and feelings at the expense of material harm. In a recent and erudite essay, Professor Alon Confino puts these elements into full view when he offers that we must center state power and minority status as elements of such racial analysis. Using them, he navigates through the din of new anti-Semitism and the pummeling violence its protected subject, Israel, enacts upon Palestinians. The confusion over anti-Semitism and racism has its own legacy in international law. Significantly, it was an outbreak of attacks on Jewish cemeteries and synagogues in Germany in 1960 that catalyzed the drafting of the 1965 Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Ultimately, anti-Semitism was not named in the treaty and was relegated to a document on religious tolerance. Compounding this confusion is the lack of a definition of race or racism in the treaty at all. Instead, what is defined is racial discrimination on the basis of, quote, race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, end of quote, which suggests race is either all of those things or none of them, including color. It was this lack of a clear definition that created so much controversy over the claim that Zionism is a form of racism in 1975, and more recently, that Israel is an apartheid state today. Tony traces the crystallization of the new anti-Semitism to the 1975 UNGA Resolution 3379, declaring Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. He describes how the resolution prompted Abba Eban, then Israeli foreign minister, to identify the, quote, new left as the author and progenitor of the new anti-Semitism, end of quote, and the vilification of the United Nations as irreparably anti-Semitic. Tony summarizes the resolution as a Soviet initiative, one that it, quote, engineered with the aim of achieving a major blow against the West, end of quote. Here, I want to respectfully challenge Tony, as his summation of the resolution's drafting history is not only inaccurate, but misses a key opportunity to lift up the Palestinian intellectual tradition, which offers a racial theory of Zionism and helps to provide much needed rigor in our contemporary discussions. Resolution 3379 was a suboptimal goal of the Palestine Liberation Organization. It sought to expel Israel from the UN, just as apartheid South Africa was expelled in 1974. Its ambassadors spent the summer of 1975 urging regional convenings to endorse the expulsion in preparation for the 30th session of the General Assembly. Efforts began in the International Women's Conference in Mexico City, continued to the Islamic Conference of Foreign Ministers of Jeddah, followed by the African Unity Summit in Kampala, and culminating in the non-aligned movement convening in Lima. The PLO only achieved support for Israel's expulsion in Jeddah. Egypt, desiring to achieve recuperation of the Sinai through US brokered negotiations, blocked the initiative in Kampala and Lima. Instead, the regional organizations condemned Zionism as a form of racism. Having failed to achieve its initial goal, the PLO worked with a coalition of non-aligned states to amend the Decade for Action to Combat Racism and Racial Discrimination, initiated in 1972, to insert the word Zionism into the text everywhere the words apartheid, colonialism, and racial discrimination appeared. The primary architect and engine for the initiative was Palestinian jurist, scholar, and activist Fayez Sayegh, who had developed a racial theory of Zionism as early as 1965. There he expounded that unlike other forms of European colonialism based on racial dominance, Zionism is based on racial elimination. He deftly used the Racism Treaty to demonstrate that Zionism produced racial self-segregation, purity, and supremacy, and pushed back against US Ambassador Patrick Moynihan, who attempted to use a biological definition of racism to defend against the accusation. Sayegh and his contemporaries were well aware of the uncomfortable association they were making. The concept of a Jewish race is a cornerstone of secular European anti-Semitism. And here it was that Zionism, rather than reject this racialization, had embodied it to insist that Jewish integration was an impossibility and must establish a state of its own. The General Assembly, constituted of an automatic majority of the Third World, passed the resolution in line with its position that Israel was part of an imperial order. In 1973, it condemned the unholy alliance, quote unquote, between Portuguese colonialism, South African racism, Zionism, and Israeli imperialism, end of quote. Not only did they consider Israel a Western imposition that divided Africa and Asia, but also, while the international community steadily isolated and condemned apartheid South Africa, Israel maintained their economic and trade relations, thereby enabling it to withstand the international sanctions. This was not an ideological vote or merely a political maneuver. It was a studied, well-grounded initiative led by Palestinians paving their own pathways to freedom and situated within a broader effort to upend an imperial world order that surely included Israel, but hardly singled it out. Now as then, this broader political context is obscured to exceptionalize anti-Semitism as a form of racism in dangerous and unproductive ways. Despite this daunting narrative, I'll close with an observation that is hopefully readily apparent. The force of new anti-Semitism today seems to be part of an extended backlash against the paradigm shift ushered in by Palestinians during the Unity Intifada in 2021, when they successfully established that theirs is a freedom struggle. The top-down, punitive, and reductionist discourse embodied by new anti-Semitism reflects a crumbling Zionist hegemony that has resorted to blatant coercive force. But as the stakes of this struggle are actual Palestinian lives, it is ultimately a losing battle. If not for Zionists, then for humanity, certainly for humanity. May we prevail, all of us.
Thanks very much, Shireen, for reading Noura's notes. It's always a kind of ventriloquism to read somebody else's notes. You did it very well. Thank you very much. So we'll move on now to Zvi Ben-Dor Benite, who will offer his thoughts.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. I mean, to a certain extent, I'm not an obvious participant. I would like to thank Tony for a very, very important book, which in the beginnings of my notes, I wrote, this is a history of anti-Semitism in our time. And it's very important to understand that this is about our time, you know, in the sense that, you know, other times have been different, but what I would try to do is actually look to some interesting parallelisms earlier about that. So, it is a history of anti-Semitism, before even we go to discuss new anti-Semitism, that occurs in a certain level. It is a level that is, you know, politics in and outside the state. It's an intrastate politics. It's about, it is a history that occurs within international organizations. It is a history that occurs, as part of diplomatic efforts and diplomatic negotiations. It is a history of efforts to affect or to have an impact on diplomacy. In other words, it occurs in a very interesting level that I think perhaps define our times. It also, and Lila already touched upon it a lot when she began. It also represents a moment in which anti-Semitism and the treatment of anti-Semitism have become a matter of bureaucracies. And that leads also the question, to how to quantify it, to count it, to identify it, et cetera, and of course the pinnacle and the book ends with attempts to come up with quote unquote working definitions of anti-Semitism. And again, the definitions are about, how we use these definitions in order to interfere with diplomatic work, with international events, with international negotiations of every sort and so on, and also in order to combat other national movements, other critics of Israel or of Zionism, et cetera. Okay, so it is interesting to me to think about the fact is like what happens to the road to how this road to these definitions is paved, and what was the story about that? What's the story about all of these things? When we think about them in terms of the past, when we look for anti-Semitism in other levels. So. Let's think of, I would like just to throw in two very bizarre moments in the history of the hatred of Jews, and because I like to think of Jewish history from the margins for many, many reasons, they are both very, very marginal. So in the late 19th century, a man who was in a mental asylum in London, by the name of Richard Brothers, came up with the idea that, the British people are of Hebrew extract, how he calls it, they're Israelites. He labeled himself as a Messiah and, a child of King David, et cetera. He was writing from the mental asylum, but actually his ideas caught quite an audience in England and gave birth to a movement that we know until today as British or Anglo-Israelism. Okay, this is a British supremacy movement that basically tries to attach itself to the chosenness of the not Jewish tribes of the tribes of Israel. Okay, and it is also virulently anti-Semitic throughout the 19th century and even perhaps of the 20th century. Okay, in the sense that it hates Jews. So here's an example of some people who basically come up with the definition of who is a Jew, come up with the definition of who is an English person, come up with the genealogy of themselves and, end up being anti-Semitic. In Japan in the late 19th century, you have a rise of anti-Semitism, but there's a problem. There's no Jews there, and all the old legacies of Christianity and Judeo-Christian relations in Europe, et cetera, don't exist. Okay, how come? Well, it turns out that in the dictionaries that technological dictionaries that the Japanese, the emerging Japanese nation has been importing from the West, so they can learn how to modernize their own country. Anti-Semitic ideas have been smuggled through these dictionaries. No one's intended to do that at all. Okay, this is before the translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion into Japanese. Okay. Turns out that, it just comes as part of the cultural package from the West, okay? So anti-Semitism is a cultural code. It moves in different directions, okay, before our time, in many, many strange directions sometimes, at some point in Germany, Aryanism, became attached to anti-Semitism and produced, the horrors, one of the horrors of the Third Reich and so on. So it moves in different directions. I say all of this is because one of the things that I find interesting in the book that Tony wrote is that it is in our time, part of the discourse about anti-Semitism is also an urge, an almost irresistible urge to define it, yes, and then to quantify it, and then to count it, and then to find it in different places. And that speaks also to the fact that, you have organizations that, basically that's their living, okay, that's their purposes. Okay, so in other words, if you fight anti-Semitism, you need to have anti-Semitism, and then you also need to define it. And the examples that I gave you right now shows actually that it can go at a level that is below that, you know, at the level of below diplomats and organizations, even some state-sponsored even some universities or university organizations or academics who are in part of that, you know, when they participated in that, they become something else than students of anti-Semitism or historians of anti-Semitism. Okay, so I pointed out because, you know, one of the things that we need to be understanding is the level. Okay, where this history is happening and who are the parties in this history. Another comment has to do with the fact that yes, I mean, there is a connection. There are some ideas that, you know, if you talk about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, yes, I mean, the problem is now what to do with that emerging equation, you know, how to identify what is just anti-Zionist, you know, and what is anti-Semitic, and how do you basically turn the anti-Zionist into anti-Semitic in order to delegitimize it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but as Lila also pointed out, you know, at the beginning, you know, I mean, Zionism is a response to anti-Semitism, also has a relationship with anti-Semitism. If you think about the idea that the Jew needs to be a productive person, okay, that's a Zionist idea. Okay, it's a response to anti-Semitism, but to a certain extent, if you use it in the wrong, if you put it in the wrong mouth, the idea that the Jew needs to be productive or the new Jew needs to be a productive human being, that's actually that's a very anti-Semitic idea. Okay, but it's part of the tenets, at least of early Zionism, with the emphasis of the work on the working on the land, etc., etc. Same works with the negation of the diaspora. Okay, another very important Zionist article, the negation of the diaspora. Okay, or shlilat hagalut in Hebrew. It's to a certain extent the negation of the diasporic Jew. Okay, but what do you mean by when you negate the diasporic Jew? Is it basically a re-internalization of an anti-Semitic idea? That brings me to the last point. Noura spoke about, you know, the fact that the Palestinians are absent from the discussion. Okay, and that is very, very, very true. But we have another category that is also to a certain extent also absent from this discussion, because it is at the end of the day, it's a very NATO, very Western Europe, Northern American discussion, you know, with some focus in Israel itself. Okay, and I'm talking about, you know, Middle Eastern Jews. Okay, if anti-Semitism and the way we understand anti-Semitism, I mean, is a European phenomenon that is based on a certain understanding of the European Jewish experience. What do we do with, you know, with the history of Middle Eastern Jewry? Okay, I mean, where there was no Inquisition, there was no like a persecuting Catholic Church, there's no legacy of, you know, tense relations between Christians and Jews. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What do we say about that? You know, how do we quantify, for example, the riots, the 1947 riots against Jews in Aden? Are they a reaction to colonial regime, you know, a revolt against the British? You know, Aden was a British protectorate. Was it, you know, was it a reaction to the creation of the state of Israel that basically all the wrath went on the local Adeni Jews? Was it something that has to do with Yemeni politics? Okay. I mean, we have these problems to define before, and in many ways in the past, we accepted the fact that we cannot fully define them. Okay. Now we have organizations who think that they can define such movements and basically can deploy their definition, you know, to events in the past. To a certain extent, it is interesting to find out that Mizrahi Jews or Middle Eastern Jews, and their even though they make about half of the population of the Jewish population in Israel, are completely almost completely absent from this discussion. Their history is absent. And if you look at the Jerusalem Declaration, certainly era, you know, there's no definition about that. Just to finalize, to close with that, so I asked, you know, where they are. I would like to find out another comment, that this is issue of a debate, you know, what is anti-Semitism among historians, among Jewish historians, as well. I mean, my colleague David Engel in 2009 wrote a very provocative article in which he basically said anti-Semitism as a concept doesn't work anymore. It doesn't explain anything, you know, in terms of when we come to analyze a historical phenomena that involves, you know, hatreds of Jews or acts against Jews. Sometimes it's just a tautology, and it cannot serve as an overarching category that explains all sorts of things. Why did people attack Jews in a certain area in Europe at a certain moment? Because they were anti-Semites. But, well, you know, I mean, isn't it a little bit of a tautology there? There was a debate in Zion, which is one of the leading organs, Jewish journals for Jewish history. There's 500 pages. A lot of people debated that question, made very, very daring statements for and against, you know, his provocative statement. What is interesting is that element is also completely absent from the debate, you know, in the history that we just read, you know, and in other words, at the level of organizations, diplomatic organizations, sometimes philanthropic organizations also, it seems that they are, you know, doing their thing, okay? Separately from, you know, heated debates, you know, that are quite sincere, you know, among other areas of people who are interested in understanding anti-Semitism. And with that, I'm going to close in the sense that, you know, hatred of Jews is real. There are people who basically, regardless of how we're going to define them, they're going to go outside and shoot at the synagogue and kill Jews. Okay, they are less concerned, you know, with how they define them. That's the third level where things are occurring on the ground. And, you know, perhaps, you know, the important part of Tony's book is actually that he shows that, you know, where the problem is that we think we can define things, where what we really want to do is, you know, come up with a working definition and then use it as a weapon or as a tool in a debate, as opposed to, you know, basically as a device that allows us to interpret and to understand our realities. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zvi. Shireen, we can now turn to you in your own voice. I don't want to put pressure on you. I do want to make sure we allow Tony time to respond to all of this and Q&A for everybody. I know Lila has to leave. Shireen, other people have had their time, so you get yours. So here you go.
I'll be as brief as possible. In his magisterial account, Tony charts a layered geography where we learn about the development and trajectories of a multiplicity of institutions combating the quote unquote new anti-Semitism. Offering a strong and grounded critique of ableist language and flawed medical analogies, Tony offers the new anti-Semitism as a field of racial governance, reminding us once and again that difference is a gift, not a burden. To speak to the question in the chat, there are many different kinds of ways of being Jewish, which is something that Tony is really insistent upon throughout this work. He exposes a multiplicity of disinformation paradigms, distinguishing along the way between the state and the individual, and time and again insists that, quote, the cause of the Palestinians is a just one. My now worn out copy of your book is punctuated by many wows in the margin. Like I was going through it and I kept saying, wow, wow, I learned so much. And the level of detail and frankly, the bravery with which you led us into these worlds are punctuated by a repeated refrain in the footnotes. Full disclosure, I was in this room, I was on that committee, is deeply inspiring as method and commitment. We all know that it can get most brutal in our internal debates and controversies, and I really want to applaud and thank you for your labor. I do that as a child of a Palestinian man and woman who became like 750,000 other Palestinians refugees in 1948. I'm a product and a scholar of what you and we call our ongoing Nakba, that spans the 100 years of denial of Palestinian political rights and peoplehood. That is Nakba with a K, not a Q, a Kaf, not a Kaf. The capitalized Nakba is now in Webster's dictionary, so you can write it in a Word document without the interruption of the red lines deeming incorrectness. It's an incorporation. Nakba is a word that punctuates the Palestinian past and present. It's a word that is in every Palestinian scholarly account, novel, poem, and testimonial. But these accounts are not really present in whatever happened to anti-Semitism. At base, this book is directed to Jewish worlds. It is an intra-Jewish conversation, and I certainly understand the need for those intra-debates and conversations. I'm engaged in them every day. Debates, political education, that's the real work in many ways. But today I want to think together about how we might reshape that inside-outside. I feel in this work that the Palestinian is a present absentee. And this is a notion that's really important to Palestinian history. We usually think of it as beginning after 1948 with the permanent temporariness of refugee life and the 1948 Israeli emergency regulation that shaped the Palestinian as present on the land, but absent in the law. This form of temporality did not begin in 1948. It was actually the British mandate and its embrace of Zionism that initiated the narrowing of subjectivities and temporalities. The troubled twin birth of the Israeli state and the Palestinian refugee condition would consolidate these constrictions. These constrictions would become central to the layered and heterogeneous character of what Edward Said called the epistemological achievement of erasure. So turning to the scholarship and knowledge production of Palestine and the Palestinians could add much to this conversation, not just about, for example, the experience of Plan Dalet, signed and dispatched to Haganah forces in March 1948, which kind of marked the shift to the war of conquest, not just about sort of the first years of the state that were very much kind of in tension with mass-scale looting, imprisonment, detention, but we might learn about things that we don't know as much about. For example, patterns of taxation, money lending, speculative financial tools, how shifts in the 18th century were setting up a stage for the commoditization of land, for a real estate market, for transformations of notables into embryonic class. You can tell I've written a book about this. So here what I'm trying to say is a turn to that history could also reveal a kind of longue durée historical entanglement with capital, land, and profit that is longer, deeper, and more complicated than a post-Netanyahu order. It would reveal another absent figure to build on Zvi, which doesn't really show up in many of these debates, the Palestinian Jew, right? Which is also a deeply important historical figure. I think also if we center Palestinian labor, we might also turn to from elite institutions to the grassroots. And therein, I think, also attend to Jewish grassroots organizations. For me, for example, organizing with Jews Against the Occupation, which actually started as an organization called Queer Jews Against the Occupation, was how I cut my teeth as a graduate student in post-September 11 New York City. I, in the present, rely on groups like JFRIJ, Jews for Economic and Social Justice, and their incredible tools like their resource, Understanding Anti-Semitism, which I use in the classroom and in political work. To quote them, JFRIJ, quote, "Anti-Semitism is real. It is antithetical to collective liberation, and it hurts Jews, but not only Jews. It undermines, weakens, and derails all of our movements for social justice and collective liberation." In my History of Israel-Palestine course, I center and teach on the history of anti-Semitism. And this is something I take great pride in. I've been doing this work since my first job at the American University in Cairo. And it's really gratifying to be a Palestinian doing this work because I think it allows me to reach audiences that others might not. And usually this course, as you can imagine, is directly linked to everyday happenings. In winter 2018, it was also very directly linked to daily iterations of anti-Semitic tropes. When the head of the National Rifle Association used themes and quotes from the canonical and toxic anti-Semitic text, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, students in the class, because they had been trained in the text with the wonderful work, A Rumor About the Jews, which is a social history of the protocols, they were able to identify, dismantle, and challenge these themes. They knew the history of the text and they had the tools to challenge it. And so really what we do in this class is center catastrophe and think about its centrality to multiple experiences, and we learn together to kind of reach across difference to embody other angles of vision. Of course, it doesn't always work, but the trying is always beautiful. Another aspect that we might see if we turn to kind of Palestinian labor scholarship and experience is the very material consequences of the IRA order, where being Palestinian renders you guilty. And I would encourage everyone to learn about Palestine Legal. They have a great website, they have annual reports, and there you can see the actual labor of responding to and representing the thousands of people who are subject to censorship and discrimination at schools, universities, on social media, smear campaigns targeting the livelihood of organizers, efforts by advocacy groups to pressure US courts, policymakers, and law enforcement to block a kind of growing tide of grassroots solidarity with Palestine. So I just want to say on a personal note, this regime is something that people like Nura and I live with every day. At its worst, it costs jobs and livelihood. On a daily level, it means that bad feeling in the pit of your stomach that based on the knowledge that you're going to have to spend hours of labor defending, evidencing, remaining vigilant. And at best, it's really a politics of distraction that keeps us from the meaningful work we all need to be getting on with, which is our joint struggles for liberation. And I think here it's really important to see how the Palestinian is a good site for this kind of joint struggle, precisely because of the deep geopolitical isolation that Palestinians are in now, in which targeting Palestinians, dispossessing them, and foreclosing their futures has become a kind of initiation ritual for the triumphant practitioners of xenophobia, racism, sexism, stupidity. Here I'm thinking of the bromance, Trump, Modi, Orban, Bibi, Sisi, MBS, all those dudes. But what I want to say is maybe we're not just this bereft outsider. And here I was struck by the Israeli relation to Palestinians as it appears in Tony's book as a kind of matters of policies or treatments or Israel's granting of rights to Palestinians. But maybe we can think of Palestine as the always already absent present of Israel. And maybe the relationship is not one of the outside. Maybe it is an inside. It is a constitutive, formative, always in tension. And I think that it's important to really think about the multiple ways that the fragmentation of land that Palestinians withstand parallels multiple scales of racialization, be it from the siege and repetitive strain of all-out assault in Gaza, to Bantustanization and separation in the West Bank, to the flimsy abeyance of permanent residency in Jerusalem, to kind of the state of second-class citizenship inside the Green Line, to the condition of exile in diaspora. In each of these places, Palestinians are dispossessed not only of land, but of time. They reside in a state of a permanent temporary. Dispossession is cumulative, repetitive, and ongoing. And I want to highlight two aspects of what that kind of cumulative dispossession means on the ground. I think one is the availability to premature death, and here I'm also informed by Ruth Wilson Gilmore as that kind of a definition of racialization. And we see this in the farewell notes young children in the West Bank are carrying in their bags on the way to school. Another is a kind of deep and abiding colonial fear, and we see this expression every day. The state and state-sanctioned violence in Nablus was just the most recent example. in many ways, you know, I mean, I promise I'm almost done. I want to travel with you back to last year, which feels like an eternity ago, after an Israeli sniper shot the veteran journalist Shireen Al-Adeimi, and thousands of Palestinians sort of across class, gender, sectarian lines carried her to her final resting place, chanting, "We may die, but Palestine will be free." Israeli police beat pallbearers, ripped down the Palestinian flag, and nearly toppled Al-Adeimi's coffin. And of course, at its most basic level, this was a kind of classical colonial policing that is, you know, very much kind of in tune with other colonial regimes that we've seen. Here, I just want to say then that maybe one of the ways out of this is to kind of de-exceptionalize this situation, and to see the ways in that the very possibility of a Palestinian social life is such a source of fear and threat. And here I want to also gesture to another Palestinian scholar, Ilyas Shufani, who sort of pointed out in the late 1960s that a settler society in the midst of large indigenous populations cannot withstand the feeling of vulnerable existence. So I want to think about vulnerability comparatively. I also want to say that the consequences of cumulative dispossession, in those consequences, we can find arenas of shared experience across racialized experiences. And I think those are things that many of us are familiar with: being ready to take flight in a heartbeat, refusing to be governed, the abject reality of collective punishment, as well as a kind of eclectic and fearless dances of defiance. I think it's really, really important that we remain vigilant in the fight against anti-Semitism and racism in all of its forms: anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, Orientalism. We must also protect the basic right to critique states. Succumbing to the forces that seek to silence us is really not an option any longer. I think the basic premise that the basic premise of a critique that shuts down the narration of Palestinian life and the call for liberation is itself racist. I think it assumes, as Tony makes very clear, that whatever claims to land, life, and freedom the Palestinian makes is less important, less worthy, less valuable. I think also we might take a lesson from indigenous scholars who teach us that indigenous peoples already inhabit what our ancestors would have likely characterized as a dystopian future. So maybe we can consider our future from what we already live as a dystopia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shireen. With such rich commentaries from so many different directions, Tony, it must be very gratifying to you as an author to have these responses, and maybe not easy to respond concisely to them. But I'm sure everybody's interested in your thoughts, and there are some questions beginning to come in on the Q&A. A reminder to people that you can offer your questions there, and we'll try and deal with them. Tony, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you all who've commented, all four of you, on my book. You've given me so much to think about. And it's almost impossible really to do justice to all that you've said in the time we've got available. Another couple of hours would be great, but we have got probably no more than about 10 minutes or so. I don't know, 10, 15 minutes maximum. Let me, I hope what I say and the time I devote to any of you commentators is not an indication of the importance or otherwise of what you've said. Everything you said was important, but I'll just try and draw out some of the key issues from what you've said, which I think I want to either just say I agree with you or to add something in relation to it. So if I work backwards and start with Shireen, and that was I found that very I won't say heartwarming, sounds terribly naff, if I can put it that way, but the fact that it seemed to me what you're saying is the crucial need to restore the humanity to Palestinians, and all the various ways in which that can be done, focusing on the things that you yourself have been studying, on labor, on work, on commerce, on all of these kinds of things. I think that that really resonates with me, because one of the things I wanted to do in my book, and although it's quite right, the book is about anti-Semitism, the book is in a sense mostly directed towards a sort of Jewish audience, not necessarily Jewish audience, but the people who sort of are looking at it from that kind of angle. Whereas I wanted the book very much to be seen as bringing the Palestinian back into the center of the picture, because one of the key things in the book is about the IHRA, and IHRA, which you, Shireen, yourself mentioned, and you talked about its consequences. And of course, IHRA cancels out the Palestinians. That is its fundamental, the fundamental consequence of it. For some people, I think that was the fundamental purpose of it. I think that what you've kind of laid out is a whole sort of curriculum, is a whole task to bring the humanity of Palestinians into the center of the debate about anti-Semitism and what it is doing to the Palestinians, and ultimately what it is doing to Jews themselves. I think what you've said really needs to be directed very much at the Jewish world, really, and it's a sort of basis for education, a basis for understanding, which isn't there at the moment, but it is a task which is very, very important. Turning then to Zvi's comments, if I may, Zvi, I think very interesting history that you revealed there about the British situation in the 19th century, and the group that you referred to. But I think what was really interesting to me in what you said is that you highlighted the issue of if you fight anti-Semitism, you need to find anti-Semitism. And of course, there is something very troubling about the whole war against anti-Semitism phenomenon, and the degree to which it is institutionalized, and the degree to which it sort of perpetuates itself. And this is something which Lila herself referred to in her remarks, and the point that you made about when you spoke about the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and then actually brought up the issue of the relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism, again, which is something which Lila also focused on. And of course, we know that that anti-Semitism fed Zionism. We know that Herzl spoke about the anti-Semitic nations will be our best friends, or some words to that effect. So that relationship is important, and it's a complex one, and it's one that is obviously not very is often ignored, almost always ignored by anti-Semitism organizations and by Jewish organizations, and perhaps just picking up one other point that you made, which I think was very important, and that is to draw attention to David Engel and his and his understanding of anti-Semitism, and the fact that he was somebody who wanted to get rid of the use of the term anti-Semitism completely, because he doesn't agree with the notion of anti-Semitism being something eternal and never changing. It's contingent and it needs to be studied in that particular way. And whilst I don't mention David Engel in my book is very much follows that kind of notion, and I think that particular sort of theme, I hope, runs right the way through the book. Now, if I come to Noura's comments, I really appreciate Noura giving me a history lesson about Resolution 3379. That was something which I should have been more careful about in the writing of the book. But I think one of the important things to take out of that, and something which I do write about in the book, is of course that after the passing of 3379, and all the hysteria there was in Israel about it, and how could Jews be called racist after what happened to them, and the racist language that was then used against the Black African states who supported the resolution. I point out in the book, of course, the hypocrisy of all of this because of the relationship which Israel then developed with South Africa, arms and giving nuclear know-how, and how that it didn't seem to bother Israel that it was associating with an apartheid state, and it was quite happy for many years to have that strong relationship. So I think that's something which it doesn't make up for the fact that I haven't covered 3379 in the way that it really should have been covered, as you suggest. I think maybe I shall now just come to Lila's comments and the three questions which Lila asked me. The first, whether I would expect to see a diminishing of the quantification effort in monitoring anti-Semitism, and that this way of understanding anti-Semitism has run its course. And the second question, capital rules, as she put it, capital, that's to say, money given by donors rules what is done in terms of studying and monitoring anti-Semitism. She asks, if the numbers keep on rising, will there be a tipping point, some moment at which the givers to anti-Semitism institutions stop believing in the return on their investment? And the third question, she picks up on my argument that Zionism today endorses an anti-Semitic construction of the Jew, and she asks whether anti-Zionism is to the new anti-Semitism as Zionism is to anti-Semitism. And she then wonders whether ending Jewish nationalism is as equally unlikely to end anti-Semitism as the end of anti-Jewish nationalism. So on the quantification, certainly it's been a very powerful tool in shaping understanding of modern anti-Semitism. And in the history of Jewish non-Jewish relations, it's relatively recent. It only became possible with integrated modern Jewish communities. And while there was monitoring of anti-Semitism before the Holocaust, it was only with Jewish reassertion in the aftermath and perceived threats to that, that monitoring rendered for public consumption into numbers of incidents became so central, with its heyday from the late 1970s through to the early 2000s. But while, as you pointed out, Lila, quantification is still deployed, it has arguably become meaningless and an anachronism. With anti-Semitism's main source of dissemination being social media, its quantification has become impossible. Furthermore, when pressure to include criticism of Israel and Zionism in the numbers grew in the 1990s, increasingly promoted by the Israeli government, and an issue of dispute between monitoring organizations in the 1990s, quantification became further politicized, increasingly used to bolster the eternalist view of anti-Semitism and to deliver a Zionist message. However, while the media's appetite for sensationalism when it comes to anti-Semitism remains strong, and Jewish groups are happy to feed it, quantification, I'm afraid, will remain a weapon in the armory of anti-Semitism forces. But as my book shows, what has superseded quantification is definition and redefinition. It's become more important, more purely anti-Semitism to demonstrate loyalty to the definition or redefinition of anti-Semitism that has at its heart the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And IHRA has become the main yardstick, both for assessing how aware the world is to anti-Semitism and for separating out the so-called anti-Semitism deniers from the guardians of the truth about anti-Semitism. And Lila is absolutely right in saying capital rules. You could say donors rule. And we agree on the role this has played and continues to play in maintaining and building what the term I use in the book, the anti-Semitism transnational field of racial governments. And quantification, especially married to the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, helps to generate donor funds. But I sense that, again, it's the redefinition of anti-Semitism, and particularly the IHRA's racialization of Palestinians, positioning them as the principal purveyors of anti-Semitism today, that's playing a more significant part in shoring up donor support. And in this way, again, to use your words, capital has grown its profit. But I don't see donors withdrawing if they are seeing it as a losing battle. As I show in my book, the leaders of the so-called war against anti-Semitism make a virtue out of failure. In any other business, the CEOs would be losing their jobs. In the anti-Semitism business, the eternal hatred requires unflinching continuity of control of the war remaining in the major Jewish organizations that for years have been dedicated to monitoring it. Finally, the question, is anti-Zionism to the new anti-Semitism as Zionism is to anti-Semitism? Defeating anti-Zionism, in effect, means promoting Zionism and love of Israel. Even if anti-Zionism was a racist ideology, which it isn't, you cannot fight one racist ideology with another. However, if Zionism, in the only form that now has any agency today, drives anti-Semitism, eradicating Zionism would contribute to reducing anti-Semitism. But would that mean the end of the project of Jewish nationalism? Well, that depends, and we're deeply into hypotheticals here if we ask that question, on whether Zionism in any full, equal rights, national self-determination solution, including the right of return, end of apartheid, and occupation, and restorative justice, morphs into civic nationalism, and the same process occurs with Palestinian nationalism. There I'll end, and let me thank all of you once again for your very kind remarks about the book, and this session has given me a lot of ideas for what I might write next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much to everybody. It struck me just thinking about this, how it all works. If I can offer just a couple of thoughts of my own on the discursive level, you've got anti-Semitism, then you've got anti-Semitism, then you get the new anti-Semitism, and then you get the new anti-Semitism, and we might end up with the new anti-Semitism sort of proliferating at some extraordinary level. And I don't mean to be frivolous in suggesting this, but it feels to me that people hold on to language and certain kinds of concepts with a kind of tenaciousness that's hard to work through. And from that point of view, it also feels to me that there's a way in which a perpetually losing battle can be a winning battle on the discursive level, because you keep propagating the thing that you're fighting against. And I think that's something that we're all thinking about here. If you'll forgive me, I'll end on a personal note, because I'm from South Africa originally, Jewish South African, and I was born and grew up under apartheid, and lived through some of that, through a lot of it at university and elsewhere. And I've written about people who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And all I will say is that, and this sort of came up in the Q&A, there will be people, Jewish people, who will feel, recentering the Palestinians in this discussion is a way of decentering Jews. And I think what the South African struggle showed in its best light, and it wasn't always in its best light, but what it showed in its best light is that, in a way, the dignity and the freedom of all depends on the freedom and the dignity of all. That you can't solve this question just by solving one part of the equation. You've got to solve all those parts of the equation at the same time and recognize that there are real parts to solve. And so it involves not only a clear understanding of the nature of the problem, but also the nature of the policies and the philosophies. At some level, it is a philosophical discussion of how to counteract it. There are examples that it's worked, so that always gives me hope, even in bad times. And I think discussions of this kind contribute very much towards that. So I think with that, we've sort of reached the end of our time. I'd like to thank Tony very much for his book, and Lila and Zvi, Shireen and Nura for their contributions. Thanks to the audience for joining us. Thanks on behalf of the Institute. Our good wishes to Alon Confino, and we'll hope to see you at further events. Thank you very much.